evening, Minnesota sports fan. Jonathan Harrison here alongside Nolan O'Hara and Tony Liebert. We've got a Gophers special. We've got our two experts in Minnesota Gophers, and with a week out from the home opener, the season opener for the Gophers as they host North Carolina coming up next Thursday at Huntington Bank Stadium. Looking forward to that. It's an exciting season, boys. Tony, let's start with you since you've got the Gophers hat on right now. You guys are both alumni of the U, recent alumni, so you guys are all buried in and deep into the weeds of Minnesota Gophers. So we'll dive into all aspects of it. What are our expectations, kind of broadly, for the Gophers this season? Coming off a 6-7 season, Quick Lane Bowl win last year, third bowl appearance in a row for PJ Fleck's Gophers. What are we expecting for the Gophers this season?
Yeah, I think the expectations kind of begin and start with like a bowl game appearance. I think if they get to a bowl game, it'd be a successful year, and if they don't, I think it would be disappointing. There's a lot of moving parts right now across all of college football with the four new teams in the Big Ten, the ever-changing landscape of NIL, the transfer portal, and it's admittingly very difficult, I think, for a lot of coaches to go through that change. And this offseason, from a personnel aspect, I think the Gophers did about as good as they could. They did pretty well in the transfer portal. They addressed some needs. They retained players like Darius Taylor and Daniel Jackson, which is becoming very difficult in the NIL and transfer portal era. So I think the expectations are that they can have a better season than last year, but I don't know if there's that ceiling that they had back in 2019 where they got to the 10-11 win range.
Nolan, what are your expectations for the Minnesota Gophers this season?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much on the same page with Tony here. I think that, PJ Fleck said a lot this offseason, talked about depth and kind of the depth that this team has that I guess he felt it didn't have last year when, injuries kind of took over and then it ended up not being as successful of a campaign as they had hoped. Um, I think I think it is kind of like a, bowl game. That's going to be the kind of marker that you're going to look for. I think that there's no reason they shouldn't make a bowl game. I think there's definitely no reason they shouldn't, and it shouldn't be by like a caveat like last season with academics. They should be winning the amount of games to win a bowl to get to a bowl game. I don't think you're going to see them contend for a Big Ten title or anything like that. But I think if some things go well, if there's much improved quarterback play from a year ago. If Darius Taylor stays healthy and looks like he did at the beginning of last season, it starts to maybe even look better than he did last season. I think they could be a team that could surprise, but I think they could also surprise in the bad way too. So you don't really know what to expect up until you see that first game of the year. I think that'll go a long way in telling kind of what this team might be made out of. But I think you should be expecting a bowl game appearance this year. And then kind of anything beyond that would be a bonus. Anything short of that would probably be a disappointing year.
How do we think the new look, the four new teams for the Big Ten, changes Minnesota's prospects in the Big Ten? Because I know they've kind of been in that middle ground for a lot of the time, and they've struggled to kind of be at the top end of the Big Ten West. Now that's kind of, I think, it's changed obviously with USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon joining the Big Ten. How does that change where we see the University of Minnesota in the Big Ten?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely interesting. I think UCLA, kind of in the modern landscape of college football, is kind of a program that has a similar ceiling to the Gophers. I don't think they're going to be competing for any conference championships anytime soon. Washington, coming off a year where they just lost in the national championship, they might be more on like the Wisconsin Iowa tier that they can kind of have a year like that every once in a while. And then USC is a really interesting program right now because they've had the times where they are one of the best programs in the country, but I have a feeling they might have an interesting transition to the Big Ten with more physical play. And I mean, personally, I think Oregon's going to be one of the best programs in the country in the next decade, let's say. So as Minnesota fits into that, it just adds more teams in the middle, in my opinion. Oregon might be on the top with the Ohio State, the Michigan, the Penn State, but it makes it more crowded in the middle, which will make it more difficult for the Gophers to have years like 2019. And I think the 6-7 win seasons are going to become more common and more, I guess, the ceiling for the team.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that too. It's a lot of I think it is. I think Oregon, Washington. I think they're fortunate they don't have to play Oregon or Washington this year. But yeah, I think it's just going to make it harder, I guess, in the long term outlook of what the ceiling is for this team. USC is, like you're saying, one of those programs that has had historically some pretty great years, but also in kind of underachieved in recent memory. But I think the Gophers are just kind of in a tough spot where they're going to have a lot of teams that are all about their level or better, and then you added Oregon on top of it with all the Nike money that they have and all the good recruiting classes they're going to bring in. I think it's going to make it really tough on the program in the future to try to keep competing in this super conference that who knows. I mean, next thing you know, the Big 10 might be the Big 20. They might add a couple more you never know what's going to happen in the next few years with how much everything's changing. So I think it's going to be a tough mix of teams to compete with here.
You mentioned the change, and that's kind of been the buzzword and the theme of the offseason for the Gophers is it feels like a monumental amount of change that has gone on the roster, but also the coaching staff. We'll get to the roster in a second. The coaching staff saw some change at the defensive coordinator spot. Joe Rossi out, I believe went to Michigan State, and then Corey Heatherman in. What can you guys tell me about the defense, the kind of defense that we should expect out of the Gophers this season with Heatherman in charge?
Yeah, Corey Heatherman, he was the linebacker coach at Rutgers last year. That's a program that has a lot of connections to the Gophers. BJ Fleck learned under their head coach, Greg Schiano, when he was coming up. And Ethan Kaliakmanis is now at Rutgers, but that's a whole nother discussion. But Corey Heatherman was the linebacker coach. Like I said, he's very aggressive play caller. He's had a few stops as a defensive coordinator at the FCS level, and I think he'll bring that to the Gophers. There'll be the fair share amount of blitzing. I think it'll look a lot similar to a Joe Rossi defense. The linebackers will be asked to do a lot. And I mean, in the short term this year, the defensive line I think is going to be very impressive. Maybe one of the better units that PJ Flex had as head coach. So I think Heatherman's going to lean on that. But I think the defense has the talent to, I guess, get back to pretty solid form this year in his first as defensive coordinator.
Yeah, I think you don't like to see a guy like Joe Rossi leave just because of how good his defenses have been throughout the years here at the U. But PJ Fleck has kind of said this offseason, it's not going to look like a drastically different. They're not going to completely change all their schematics defensively this year. But everything I've seen from Corey Heatherman media availabilities or podcast appearances, he just seems definitely like that football kind of guy. Somebody you really kind of like to have on a coaching staff. He's talked about how he wants this defense to play fast and physical. It sounds like they're going to be swarming to the ball. It does seem like a really exciting kind of defense. I'm excited to watch it in the season opener. I think I think there is a lot of room for this team to kind of bounce back. It was a tough year for the defense last year. I think there's a good chance that you could see a more improved unit here. But I don't think it'll be a crazy different from what we've seen in the Rossi years. But I am excited to see what this kind of fast and physical defense looks like this year.
Yeah, it should certainly be interesting. I know you kind of mentioned, you guys kind of hinted at some of the changes on the defensive personnel front. One of the big exits, Tyler Nubin heading off to the NFL. Who replaces him in the secondary for Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, at the safety position, the leader there will kind of be Darius Green, who played a lot last year, kind of in his first year as a full-time starter. He'll be the veteran guy there. And then they have a lot of really exciting players behind him, kind of for the future, that I think will get a lot of opportunities. Coy Parrish is a guy that was one of the highest recruits ever to commit to Minnesota, and it might not be day one that he sees a lot of time at safety, but behind him there's Coleman Bryson, who, as a true freshman, he was the bowl game MVP when the Gophers played in the Pinstripe Bowl against Syracuse. That would be 2 years ago now. So he's a guy that might start day one, and then he'll compete maybe with Coy Parrish. And then there's even other guys behind them, like Kerry Brown, who's another young player who's a high recruit, seen a couple snaps here and there. And there's a lot of talent in the secondary. That's a position that Fleck and his staff have recruited very well since being at the Gophers with Tyler Nubin, Antoine Winfield, and it might not be a week one drastic like we replace Tyler Nubin, no issues. It might take a little bit, but I think there's definitely some talent there.
Are we going to see Nolan Coy Parrish get some playing time early on, or is this something that Gophers fans are going to have to wait to see this highly sought after recruit?
I think I mean I don't know. It's kind of tough to say. I think like Tony said, he's probably not your day one starter, but you'd almost be a little surprised if he doesn't make his way onto the field at some point, considering how highly sought after of a recruit he is. Kind of what there is there, and it does seem like again not day one, but it does seem like he's kind of the next in that line of great safeties that have come out of the U. You have Antoine Winfield, who's you know been fantastic for Tampa Bay Buccaneers now since he got drafted. Tyler Nubin drafted by the Giants. It seems like Parrish could be that trajectory to be that next star safety at the U who makes it to the NFL level. But I think the answer to who replaces Tyler Nubin day one, probably nobody. It's hard to replace an NFL caliber safety right away. But I think you might see Parrish at some point this year. Probably not the day one starter, but he does. I mean, super bright future for him, obviously here.
So then, defensively, last question here on the defense. Each of you guys give me one guy on the defense that you're excited to watch this year throughout the season. Tony, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a couple guys I'm pretty excited to watch. There's a lot of names on the defensive line that I think could have a big year. But I think it's Cody Lindenberg. I've been really impressed with him, listening to him at like the Big Ten media days, some other media availability this offseason. He seems like he's kind of taking that next step as a leader, which I think is really important for the linebacker position, especially when you have a new defensive coordinator coming in. I This will be his first year that hopefully he can stay fully healthy as a full-time starter. He's had a lot of experience playing, but he hasn't been able to play like a full 12-game sample size. So I think if he puts that together, he can kind of be that Blake Cashman, Kamal Martin, Moriano Sarimaran type of player that those really high-level Joe Rossi defenses had. And I think if the Gophers are able to get that out of him, I think that kind of will set the tone for the rest of their defense.
I'm excited about Ja Joyner. I think he's going to be fun to watch on the defensive line. Led the team at sacks last year. Seems kind of poised to take a step up this year. So I think that will be an interesting player to keep an eye on, see what he can do as far as help the pass rush.
I know another one of the big name recruits or transfers, I guess, if we're going to dive into the transfer market. We're going to transition to the offense here in a second, but a big transfer that the Gophers got this last year, Jackson Howard from LSU. How do we see him fitting into this Gophers defense? Is he going to get playing time right away, or is this something that he'll have to build into?
Yeah, it's very interesting because defensive end pass rusher is probably the deepest position on their team. Like Nolan mentioned, you have Ja Joyner, who has legitimate like NFL potential. Danny Strigow is a guy who has a lot of experience. Jalen Logan Redding plays a little bit on the inside, but he'll step on the outside too. And that's one of I guess, the best like three-man trios in the Big Ten probably. And then after him, you have Anthony Smith, who was the Gophers' number one recruit a couple cycles ago. So throwing Howard into the mix is a lot of talent there. I think he'll definitely see the field in some capacity, but he has 4 years of eligibility, I believe, remaining. So it might be something we see next year or the year after, where he kind of becomes the number one option. But I think he'll definitely see the field a little bit, but it'll definitely be a rotation this year at that position, I think.
All right. So, as we mentioned, transfers were a big name in the game for Minnesota. 12 transfers out, 14 transfers out, 12 in. The big names are at the quarterback position in those, arguably. Max Brosmer in from New Hampshire, and then Ethan Kaliamakis out to Rutgers, as you said earlier on, Tony. Nolan, what are we expecting out of Max Brosmer? We'll talk about some of these other offensive stars in a bit, but what are we expecting? How does Max Brosmer fit into this offense, and do the Gophers change to fit Max Brosmer, who comes from a passing style offense, pass first offense? Does that change how Minnesota play on offense?
My assumption would be no. I think it's probably still going to be a very run heavy team. I think you're going to see Darius Taylor carry the ball quite a bit and work in the other running backs as well. I think it does maybe change. I mean, the passing attack was not good, to put it mildly, last year. So I think with a more veteran guy who did lead, I believe he led the FCS in passing yards last year. Um, very few interceptions, a lot of touchdowns. So good decision making. He's got a weapon in Daniel Jackson. I think that you could probably see an improved passing attack. I don't think it's going to be a fundamental change of how the Gophers decide to approach their offense, though. You've seen all these years under Fleck, aside from the one 2019 season when you have two NFL wide receivers that they threw the ball downfield a little bit more. Otherwise, it's been Mo Ibrahim running the ball 30 times a game. That was the case with Darius Taylor last year. I think it's probably going to be a pretty similar style, pound the run kind of an offense. But I do think there will probably be a little bit more trust there in a more veteran quarterback who's has more experience, and it seems like he's a guy they really like. So I think it will be interesting to kind of see what that looks like. But if my expectation would be that they're most likely going to be a pretty run heavy team still.
I think the most interesting thing with Brosmer is honestly his like personality, because listening to a lot of Gophers press conferences over the last year or last few years, Tanner Morgan and Ethan to an extent kind of seemed like a clone of PJ Fleck almost, that they would have very like coach speak answers, and kind of they were obviously recruited by Fleck, so they have a bit of a closer relationship with him. And they knew him since they were 16, 17, or wherever their recruitment started. So Brosmer is a guy that had an entire college career in New Hampshire, so he's had a lot more life experience. And I think when you're playing a sport like college football, where it is a lot of young players, I think that is important. But yeah, it really just comes down to the scheme, because it seems like every year PJ Fleck and his entire staff talk about how they're going to try to throw the ball a little bit more, and it really hasn't happened since that 2019 year. They obviously want to get back to that level, um, but they certainly have the personnel to do so. It just comes down to the fact if they want to call those plays and put their players in the situations to perform at a high level.
You mentioned that personnel in the passing game. Uh, who's picking up the ball, or who's going to be on the receiving end a lot of those passes? I know we got Daniel Jackson in there, Brevin Spanford off to the NFL with the Cowboys. Who's helping out in the passing game in the receiving end of the department?
Yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting aspects heading into the season. Last year, you had Corey Crooms, who was probably the number two option in the passing game. He was a transfer in. Now he's off to the NFL. The number two option, they have plenty of choices. Lemeke Brockington's a guy who, when he's had the ball in his hands, he's been an electric playmaker. And from my point of view, watching him in practice, I think that's a guy they should try to get involved. Elijah Spencer, who was a transfer from Charlotte a few years ago, he's a guy that I've seen a lot of high level play out of him from Charlotte and in practice, but hasn't necessarily put it together on the field for the Gophers. And then another transfer who came in is Tyler Williams from Georgia, who's arguably the most talented player in that entire room. But like Nolan and I mentioned before, it's just kind of opting to try to get those players involved because in past years, players like Dalen Wright and Chris Almond Bell last year too, they have the talent there. They just kind of haven't used it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of what it seems like that over the past couple of years under PJ Fleck is that there's just been hesitancy. It feels like to go towards the passing game, and obviously with the struggles that Callie McManus had at the quarterback position, it seemed like there was valid reason for kind of deciding and opting towards a more run heavy approach. So other stars on the offense, I know the big one is the left tackle Ariante Ursere. What are we expecting from him? I know he's kind of on that fringe borderline of a potential first round pick. What are we expecting from him this year, Nolan?
By the sounds of it, I think he establishes himself as a first round pick. I don't think there's any reason to think that he's going to have any kind of step back. I think that's going to be a real nice left tackle to have for Brosmer. I think that'll only help the passing attack too. Um, yeah, I think he's going to be very good, and I think that'll be really helpful for a quarterback who's he's had time to learn, obviously, but it'll
Yeah.
still be a different animal when he steps out on the field and playing Big Ten football versus FCS football. So I think that'll be a huge asset to him.
The star of this offense last year, Darius Taylor, 799 yards, rushing 5 touchdowns on 138 attempts in just 6 games due to a lot of injuries. If he can stay healthy this year, Tony, what's the ceiling for this offense?
That's a great question. Darius Taylor arguably might be one of the most talented running backs the Gophers have really ever had. But it comes down to staying healthy, which will be a big thing, and how many carries he ends up getting. PJ Fleck has enjoyed using one bell cow running back kind of throughout his whole tenure, but there's been a lot of injuries to the room, even back with Rodney Smith and Shannon Brooks. Muhammad Ibrahim had plenty of injuries, and even behind him, like Trey Potts had injuries, and so the health of the running back room will be a big factor in this year. But I think the Gophers made an emphasis of adding depth to that room in the offseason. They added Marcus Major from Oklahoma in the transfer portal, Say Bangura from Ohio, and Jaron Magnum from Michigan State, who are all three guys that I think if there happens to be an injury to Taylor or that running back room, they can kind of step up and contribute at a high level. So I think the ceiling, the sky's the limit for Darius Taylor, but health will be the number one factor, which is something that's always hard to predict in the crazy sport of football.
Yeah, Nolan?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think if Darius Taylor can stay healthy, at a certain point, teams are just going to have to sell out to the run playing the Gophers, and that'll really open things up for Brosmer. Get guys like Daniel Jackson involved. Get guys like Tyler Williams involved, Elijah Spencer, and those receivers that we are talking about earlier. So if Darius Taylor starts popping off a couple 200-yard games like he did towards the beginning of last season, that's going to be the scouting report for the on when teams are preparing for the Gophers, and that'll really open things up. I think play action, but it all depends on how healthy he can stay because they do have a lot of good pieces in that running back room, but obviously Darius Taylor is a little bit of a different animal than some of the other.
Yeah, kind of, I guess, bouncing off that for Nolan, I think the main reason for optimism on this whole team this year, I think, is kind of the trenches on the offensive and defensive line. There's a lot of talent. We mentioned Ursary on the O line and Josh Joyner on the D line. I think you can make a real argument this is kind of one of the better years in PJ Fleck's whole tenure with the Gophers that they've had, combining both the offensive and defensive lines with talent. There could be multiple pros on both sides of the ball, which is something that they haven't had since 2019, and they haven't had often. So, if they're able to perform at a high level on both of those sides, that's when you can kind of open the door for those playmakers like Darius Taylor on offense and like a Coy Parrish or Cody Lindenberg on defense to make plays and get turnovers on defense and have explosive plays on offense.
You mentioned PJ Fleck there. Heading into year 8, has, as you said just now, a couple potential pros on the team. It feels like things are starting to get a little bit more positive after a down year last year. What's the pressure level on Fleck? Because it's year 8 at this point. He's been here long enough where he's had a series of classes that are all his own. This whole program is all his own. It feels like he's on his 17th extension since joining the program in 2017. What's the pressure level on PJ Fleck this year, Nolan?
Um, I honestly don't think it would be very high. I think even if they kind of, you know, had a terrible year, if it all goes haywire, I don't think he's really in any danger of getting fired. I don't think the expectations from the athletics department are really that high for this program. If he keeps getting them into bowl games, keeps winning, maybe it's, I mean, if it's a crazy bad year, if they don't win a game, maybe that ratchets up the pressure a little bit. But if they keep kind of having average years, winning bowl games, I mean, the thing too is like the academics have been really good since Fleck took over. There haven't been, huge program wide scandals since Fleck took over. So things like that, he's done a really good job with, and they've been pretty consistently making bowl games. They had the really good year in 2019. I don't think right now there's really any. He's not on the hot seat by any stretch. If things started getting bad, if it's another year like it is this year, even if it's another like 6-7 kind of year like last year, I don't think that's really going to put much pressure on him. I think he's pretty secure where he's at right now.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with Nolan there. I think the athletic department is more than happy with the success that he's had, and if he continues doing that with the 6-7 win seasons, and then maybe you get an 8-9 win season in there, I think the athletic department's aware that that's kind of where Minnesota is as a program. I think to be honest, I think he'll be the coach of the Gophers as long as he wants to. The question is if he wants to keep coaching the Gophers. If he realizes in this new college football world that there's a ceiling at a program like Minnesota. And last offseason, there were rumors of him going to UCLA. So I think the bigger question is if he wants to stay here long term. He's very good at making it seem like he wants to. But I think anyone that follows college football knows that coaches don't always mean what they say. So I would say the much bigger question is if he sees a future at Minnesota rather than if the athletic department sees a future with him.
Yeah, do you think some pressure from the athletic department will help him see that, or is that something that you don't ever see the athletics department putting the pressure on because of how college football and college sports in general have just been kind of turned on its head over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it would be really interesting if, like, hypothetically, let's say Fleck moves on or there's some unforeseen circumstance that pushes him out the door. I don't really know what, like, options Minnesota would have in the hiring pool. Like, they would kind of have to go after a up and coming guy from the group of five ranks, and it would kind of just be restarting with Fleck. So I wouldn't see much benefit from that from the Gophers side. That's why there's almost pressure on the Gophers athletic department to make sure he stays if he keeps getting 6-7 wins, because if he doesn't, I don't know what their options are going to be.
All right, let's close out here. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. I did not tell you I was going to do this. We've kind of had a theme this week of making bold predictions and saying bold things. I want one bold prediction from each of you for the Gophers football team this year. Tony, we'll start with you, then we'll end with Nolan.
Yeah, so back on our Vikings Bowl predictions, Joe kind of had the mixture of being super pessimistic and optimistic. I'm going to go on the pessimistic side.
All right.
I think there are a lot of changes on this Gophers team. And in the past, admittingly, I've kind of bought into the hype some years and think that there's a better ceiling than there is. And I think there's a scenario that the Gophers win 4 games this year. And I guess my bold prediction is that they will. I think week 1 against North Carolina is a huge swing game because if they drop that one, they have games against Rhode Island and Nevada, which are they're going to be heavily favored to win. So there's 2 wins there. But then right after that, they got Iowa at home, Michigan on the road, and USC at home, which are 3 very droppable games. So with a blink of an eye, you could start the season 2-4, and then there's a lot of coin flips in between there with teams like Maryland, Rutgers, and Illinois that I could see those games going either way. So there'd be room to pick up wins there, but just as much room to pick up losses. So my prediction is that they miss a bowl game entirely and have 4 wins.
All right, Nolan.
I was thinking about going on the more optimistic side, but it's not like blindingly optimistic by any means. My bold prediction: they're going to beat USC this year. That's going to be my bold prediction. They'll beat USC. That doesn't mean they won't lose to Michigan by 50 again. That doesn't mean that they will, even be able to hang on to the Floyd of Rosedale. But I'm gonna say that they'll beat USC this year. That's going to be a signature win for them.
Nolan, you mentioned the trophies. It's almost like you knew where I was going next. 4 trophy games this year. How many do they take home, boys?
I'm gonna say the 4th one would be Penn State. So it's Penn State, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. I say I'm gonna keep rolling with the pessimistic. I say they only win 1. I think Wisconsin is. I think that game's going to be up for grabs this year. I'm not a big fan of their outlook. I'm not a huge fan of Tyler Van Dyke, the quarterback they got from the transfer portal. So I think that game will be up for grabs, and I think they'll end the year out strong like PJ Fleck usually does, and they'll have a building block heading into next year with the Axe back in Minnesota.
Well, let's be honest. You can never trust someone who leaves Miami for Wisconsin. So it just doesn't make sense. Nolan, Your thoughts? How many trophies they take home?
Well, the little brown jug's definitely coming home. No, I don't think so. I think you're looking at 2 at best. I think it might be hard to hang on to Floyd. I think they can beat Wisconsin. Like Tony said, I just don't think Wisconsin is what it was. I think they're kind of in a transition phase down year. So I think they should be able to get the Axe back. They could maybe beat Iowa again this year, but I think the other 2, it's not looking too good.
No 2019 Magic against Penn State?
I don't see it this year.
That game was awesome.
Give them a couple more NFL wide receivers and maybe the best safety in the NFL now, and really good running. The all-time leading rusher of the program, and maybe they could do it. But
I think there's going to be a lot of hype for a couple home games. The Penn State one, the Iowa game will obviously have a ton of hype leading up to it, and the USC one, first Pac-12 team at home. So there's plenty of home games that'll be fun to watch this year for the Gophers.
I'll have you know it's the Pac-2 now. Gotta get that correct. All right, that's been another edition of Bringing the Sports here on YouTube. Go follow Tony and Nolan's work all over on Bring Me the Sports. This has been an edition of Gophers on SI. Boys, we will talk to you later, and Minnesota Sports Fans will talk to you right back here tomorrow, right here on Bring Me the Sports.